When I was 7, Grandma took my little wool coat on her lap and, without asking, slipped a tiny scrap of cloth into the lining and stitched it shut with a slow, careful hand. She pressed the seam flat with her palm and whispered, "This will protect you." I believed her the way children believe in warm things and small rituals. An amulet against rain, a talisman for courage on the first day of school, an invisible shield when the nights felt too big. The coat smelled of lanolin and old smoke and the faint sweetness of the soap she used. Her fingers were knobby and warm. The needle caught the light when she worked. I remember feeling foolish and proud at once, like I'd been entrusted with something grown up and secret. "Keep it with you," she said, tucking the collar under my chin. "Put it on, and nothing will happen." For 30 years that memory sat in me like a pebble in a shoe, small, irritating, easy to ignore. It was the sort of thing you pull out at family dinners to make people laugh. Grandma was superstitious. She sewed charms into our clothes. We used to joke and touch the little welt where the stitch showed through, and Grandma would pat my hand like a queen humoring a court jester. It felt harmless. It felt like love. Then one summer, during a storm that leaked through the eaves of her house, I learned what she'd meant. If you like stories that unfold like old family letters, slow to reveal their margins, stick around and subscribe. There are more like this. Teresa was born in a town that barely fit on a map, a place where morning began when the bakery door opened and evenings were marked by the clatter of dominoes on the cafe table. She had the quiet, deliberate way of someone who'd learned to measure words because life had taught her they were valuable. When she spoke about Antonio, her first husband, her voice would turn softer, like a radio fading into static. She married young, had a child, and learned how to hold grief in her jaw for reasons children cannot understand. Antonio died in 1957. That date is a flat fact. No melodrama, no flourish. The town remembered him as a man with a crooked laugh and a bowl-like hand for catching children who ran too fast. I only knew him from faded photographs and the stories Grandma told, the ones that ended with a small shrug and a, "We carry on." After his death, Teresa kept moving. She kept the child warm. She kept a job when she could, and she kept a small, resolute faith that the world would not tilt forever. Years later, someone named Nestor arrived like a tidy wind. He had a steady job, a ready smile, a way of making houses feel organized, like someone who could fold chaos into neat piles. To anyone who watched from the outside, he was the man who steadied Teresa's life. He courted with the kind of propriety people in our town approved of, bringing coffee at dawn, repairing the leaky porch, and opening doors the way people like on the street. He married her, and for a long stretch, they were to the neighborhood the picture of normal. He also owned a coat, an old brown coat with a particular smell, as if it carried its own weather. Nestor treated that coat like a relic. It hung in a closet that was, for all intents and purposes, off limits. When I was small and curious and tried once to peek inside the closet during a rainstorm, he scolded me gently but firmly, and Teresa, with that accustomed half-smile, told me not to touch it. "It belonged to his father," she said once, lifting her chin. "It must be respected." Respect was a word that wrapped around the coat the way moths coil around sweater sleeves. It meant nothing should be taken from it. It meant no one should disclose what it carried. It became, in our household, something like a family altar, placed high, rarely acknowledged, and never to be disturbed. Everyone learned the rule. Rules are a kind of language, a way to survive rooms that have secret currents. I remember Nestor more in routine than in passion. He noticed dust lines precisely. He kept his shoes in order. He had a habit of returning a cup to the exact same saucer, as if the world could be made right again by aligning objects. When he smiled, his eyes stayed cool, which made the smile feel like a form of calculation. The children, my mother Luia among them, grew where the rules fell. They learned when to speak and, more often, when to hold silence. People outside thought Teresa had been saved from being alone. Those inside the house learned that salvation could look very much like control. What I didn't know as a child was that the things a household leaves undisturbed often hide the deepest truths. We leaned into ritual because it was less dangerous than inquiry. We accepted the coat's sanctity because it was easier than asking why. Time passed. The town changed in small, petty ways. A new bus route, a grocery store with fluorescent lights, the cafe's radio that started playing faraway songs. The coat stayed the same. It watched seasons pass like a century. Children grew. Marriages strained and restitched. Pots and pans gained their familiar nicks. The coat was always folded on its shelf like a weather that would never touch us. I left for a while. College, a city with buses and bright street lamps that never knew our names. Every time I returned, Teresa would have a new story trimmed carefully, and Nestor would be the same tidy presence in the doorway. I would touch the seam on my child's coat and feel that small weight of the scrap she'd sewn in. "It will protect you," she'd say, half joking, because those words were both shield and blessing. For a long time they were also a secret held between my chest and my coat. The rain that began the unraveling came slow and persistent, the kind that tests roofs more than storms. It started one June afternoon, a soft insistence, and grew to a drip that found weak spots we had long stopped checking. Water traced a path along a beam in the attic, then along the plaster, then down where the coats were kept, pooling into a small, dark menace. I was home for the weekend, visiting, the sort of trip where you return to find the furniture familiar and the air slightly altered by time. Teresa called me into the hallway like she always did when there was something small to be done. "Help me fetch that box, help me move that chair," and pointed to the closet where the coat hung. "There's a leak," she said. "We should air things out." Nestor looked at the coat like someone staring at a relic he'd owned long enough to think of it as an extension of himself. His hands hovered for a moment, almost reverent, before he reached in. I remember the way he folded it, cautious and precise, as if he were wrapping a fragile memory. He handed it to me with a kind of involuntary stiffness and said, "Just keep it dry." For a moment it was like any other chore. Move the coats, dry the closet. I took my grandmother's brown coat from his arms and felt the familiar weight of it. It smelled the way it always had. I set it on the bed to inspect the dampness and, without thinking much, ran my fingers along the inside seam where the lining met the wool. That's when I felt it. The edge of paper, as thin and foreign as a fish scale, tucked in where the fabric was hand-stitched. Time dilates around discoveries like that. The air narrowed. The room slid away a little. I remember my palms sweating, the way my fingers trembled, and the noise of rain like something happening in another house. I did something small and ridiculous. I folded the collar over to hide the seam because hiding felt safer in that instance than exposing what might be true. Then I unfolded it again. There were 2 envelopes, yellowed with age, their corners rounded by years of being kept. The topmost had handwriting that I recognized even before I read a single word. Nestor's script had a neat, slanted discipline. The date at the top read 1957. I didn't see the second envelope's date until later. The first breath I took was of rain and old paper and a fear that had teeth. There were a few lines visible when I opened the flap. Not a long narrative, but a compact admission. A mention of small measures, a reference to sickness that seemed ordinary, and then a sentence that made the room change its shape. I did this so she would be mine. The words sat there, cool and unadorned. I read them twice, then a third time, because the brain tries to buy itself time, to find a misprint, a joke, anything that might keep an ordinary life intact. I think I read the note aloud, because I remember the sound of my own voice as if it had been recorded on a cheap tape and played back. I did it so she would be mine. Teresa was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she shelled peas. When I said her name sharp enough to startle her, she looked up and smiled before seeing the paper in my hand. The smile changed like a light being turned down. It didn't go out. It just retreated behind a more complex face. She stood very still and took the envelope with hands that had stitched my childhood coat. She did not gasp. She did not throw the paper. She sat at the table and read, her eyes glazing only for a second, then focusing with a kind of professional steadiness. Sometimes grief or betrayal carve a channel that people proceed along as if they are on a rail. Teresa moved with a similar, contained momentum. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "In the coat, the brown coat, in the lining." She did not answer right away. She folded the paper along its old crease, and then said something so simply arranged it sounded like a verdict. "It's dated the year Antonio got sick." Years of tenderness and complication condensed into that moment. What had been a family object, respected, untouchable, was suddenly a repository. The coat, which had kept out wind and rain, had also been used to hide a very different weather. The confession of a crime. Teresa's mouth tightened. She looked at me in that way she looked at me when I had scraped a knee and pretended it was nothing. The look that was more than mothering, caution bordering on calculation. "We shouldn't take it out into the open," she said. "Not yet." "Not yet?" I asked, because my stomach felt like scrambled pages. "There's danger in speaking too quickly," she replied. "There's also danger in doing nothing, but we have to be careful." Her caution made sense in the way only people who have lived long enough to know the slow arithmetic of consequences can understand. She told me a little of what happened after Antonio got sick, how the doctors thought it was something that could be treated, how the symptoms came and went, how friends offered condolences that felt rehearsed. But the letter was a new kind of answer. If the note said what it appeared to say, if Nestor had indeed admitted to giving doses over time, then the explanations we had accepted for decades were suddenly built on a lie. There are certain betrayals that make you rethink not just a marriage or a history, but the fidelity of memory itself. You begin to wonder what else had been arranged to keep the truth away. The coat, the rule about not touching it, the polite neighborhood rumors. Suddenly they were elements of a careful theater. We sat for a long time with the envelope between us. She told me to put it back where I'd found it and to make it look as if I hadn't seen it. "Leave it there," she said. "For now." Her voice was not fearless. It was the sound of someone calculating the ways to protect a brood of small lives. "Some things belong to us to carry," I argued, but quietly. "We could go to the police. We could show them this." She shook her head. "You know how long ago it was. Evidence fades in the eyes of the law, but even more. What would exposing it do to the children? To Luia? To you?" She hesitated, then in a tone that was both apology and explanation. "I need to think of safety, not justice." It was at that moment the first thread of all this, my grandmother's hand sewing a scrap into my coat, unspooled in my mind. Protection had not meant warding off imaginary things. It had also been about cushioning a family from the blow of a truth that might not only break marriages, but crush livelihoods and lives that had been rearranged around a lie. Perhaps that tiny scrap of fabric had been a way for her to give me a talisman against ordinary fears, while reserving something bigger, a kind of guarded knowledge. For a moment she judged less dangerous. There was also another thing to consider. Fear is contagious. Men like Nestor, who carry control as a habit, can smell a threat to their dominion. "If he knew we found this," I began, and my words refused to finish the sentence because the room seemed to be holding its breath. "He mustn't know," Teresa said. "Not now." Her hand touched my arm, and for a moment she was the woman who stitched and soothed, not a woman confronting 30 years of entanglement. "We will do what we must," she added, but quietly, for the children, for the house. I wanted, naively perhaps, to imagine what we must would look like. Go to a lawyer, put everything in a safe deposit box, show the letters to a trusted friend. These were the steps that felt fair in the throes of righteous shock. Teresa had seen more. She had watched how community courts and whispered gatherings wrap around people like nets. There are judgments that are kinder than legal ones, and cruelties that are not counted in courtrooms. For 2 days we pretended nothing had changed. We folded the coat back into its place. We played small domestic roles. We laughed at a radio joke. We shelled beans and discussed, in the most neutral terms, what to make for dinner. These ordinary acts felt like stitches across a tear. But in the night the house did not sleep. I heard footsteps in the hall. Sometimes they were Nestor's, sometimes they were Teresa's, and sometimes they were the past moving like a shadow. The house had acquired a secret, and was learning the weight of it. On the third day I walked to see Luia. She is the sort of person who carries her protective instincts in the shape of immediate action. In her hands, issues compress into lists, and lists become decisions. She listened to me with the kind of silence that is not empty but full of readiness. When I told her about the letters and how they'd been hidden in the lining, she asked for the envelope without surprise, only with a hardening in her jaw that I'd seen in family photos after funerals. We met in the kitchen Teresa had kept spotless for decades. Luia put the paper on the table as if placing a map and traced the edges with the tip of her finger. We should photocopy it. We should lock the original somewhere the person who did this cannot reach, she said. This is evidence. And if Nestor knows? I asked. The question felt unbearable. Luia's hand curled into a fist on the table. If he knows, then we keep the original somewhere safe, and we decide who else should know. Maybe a lawyer, maybe the hospital. Her voice trembled at the edge, a crack revealing the strain. We owe Antonio the truth. I thought about what it meant to owe the dead. It is easy to say, we owe him, when grief is fresh. It is harder when the debt requires the living to tear the fabric of their own lives. There would be questions. Would we be re-traumatizing people? Would speaking the truth make our family whole, or would it set off another kind of shrapnel? In Teresa's kitchen, those questions seemed like armed things. That afternoon, as if the house itself could not hold the news, Nestor called. He asked for Teresa in that clipped tone he used when he wanted something small and neat. I remember Luia's face as she answered, all composure then a hardening, and the way Teresa sat up straight with a book in her lap, like someone preparing for a technical demonstration. When Nestor spoke, his words were casual at first. Weather, plans for dinner, a request to pick up something from the store. But as all conversations around secrets tend to do, this one narrowed to a point. I was in the closet, he said, and a chill ran up my spine though the walls were warm. I noticed the lining was loose. I thought maybe we should have it mended. There was a beat where I expected Teresa to say something like, "Of course, dear," and move on. Instead, she was quiet, and then she said, steadier than I have the courage to be. It was damp. It needed airing. There was a pause, and then Nestor said something I will never forget for how calmly it was delivered. Be careful what you do with old things. Some things are better left where they belong. It was a statement designed to mean a dozen things at once. Warning, intimidation, almost an invitation to forget. The sentence carried an undertow I had not anticipated. Possessiveness disguised as counsel. I could hear the air change in the kitchen. My grandmother's face didn't flinch, but there was a line at the corner of her mouth that said she had noticed the current. Luia was breathing differently, quick now, like someone ready to run. I understood, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that Nestor knew enough to speak in this tone. He might not say, "I know you found the letter," but he had framed the conversation so that the idea of discovery floated between the syllables. After the call, we sat in the kitchen around the table like jurors deciding a sentence. It is funny how quietly dangerous people can be, how they can wield influence without ever raising their voice. Nestor's words felt like the first small hammer blow on something we had not recognized as fragile. Teresa folded her hands around the paper. "We will not be hasty," she said again, and there was something unyielding about it. "We will plan." We planned to plan. It was a plan of the kind adults make, a series of small steps meant to keep the house from burning rather than to extinguish the flame entirely. We agreed to move the letters to a safer place, to make copies, to speak to one trusted friend, and to keep our movements quiet. Luia wanted to bring the matter to a lawyer. I thought of the coat on the bed, its secret sewn shut for decades, and felt the bitter irony that my grandmother had sewn protection into my coat, and now we were sewing protection around the proof of a murder. That night I slept poorly. The image of the envelopes kept returning, not as paper, but as a physical weight in my chest. I thought of Antonio's photograph on the mantel, his smile frozen, the same man who had once fetched a ball my mother had thrown too hard. I thought of the baby that Teresa had held, The life ached around like a bruise. I tried to imagine the kinds of small measures that could have taken a life. Not dramatic scenes from novels, but quiet, insidious administration. The mind recoils from that intimacy. It seeks to replace it with more palatable notions. But the paper had said what it said. The next morning, there was a decision to make. Keep the letters hidden and safe, or expose them. We chose the former for reasons that were both strategic and maternal. There is something that happens when you put a family's safety ahead of retribution. Your moral algebra shifts. Teresa's argument was not that justice didn't matter. It was that the children's welfare and the practicalities of living in a small town where reputation determines everything had to be weighed. That afternoon, while the sky was clear and the rain only a memory, Louis and I drove to the bank and put copies in a safety deposit box. The originals we folded and placed within an old Bible Teresa kept in a drawer that Nestor rarely opened. It felt both sacrilegious and sanctified to hide truth in a place meant for prayers. The layers of protection looked absurd in the bright sun, but they were the only thing we had that seemed capable of preventing immediate harm. We told ourselves it was a temporary shelter. We told ourselves we were buying time to figure out next moves. But there is a cost to secrecy, too. Secrets harden into things that become part of the furniture. They can also protect their keepers from the very justice that would set them free. That evening, while we sat in the dark living room listening to the radio in a silence that was not comfortable, Teresa reached for my hand as if to stitch a small memory into the present. "When I sewed that scrap into your coat," she said, "I meant you to carry a piece of softness. I did not imagine it would be a shield from this." Her voice was small, an admission that the things we do for love are not always the things that will save us. "I thought I was protecting you from the cold," she added. But protection comes in strange shapes. Outside, the night kept its own counsel. Inside, the house hummed with the fragile sound of normality pretending to be uninterrupted. I lay awake, thinking about the way an object, like a coat, can become a repository for so many things. Warmth, memory, shame, confession. I thought about the way my grandmother's hands moved when she stitched, how a seemingly benign action can hold more than it promises. There was a line in the confession that had lodged under my ribs like a splinter. I did it so she would be mine. The language was blunt in a way that made the entire notion of marriage feel different. How does a woman reconcile a life built, knowingly or not, atop such an admission? How does a grandchild reconcile the tenderness of a hand that once stitched with the knowledge that the same hands may have been part of the mechanism that ended another life? We were all holding stories, as if stories were valuable items to be stacked in a trunk. And in our house the trunk had a lock whose key was fear. At the end of that week, Nestor called again. His voice had that same measured tone. This time, though, he asked if we could meet to talk in the market square. "Just to discuss things," he said. Meeting in public was a tactic known to many. It reduces menace, puts witnesses within earshot. It also offers a stage. I had a sense then that he wanted to control the narrative. I had a sense, too, that if he suspected we knew, a public setting would be his way of asserting dominance without a confession. Teresa declined. She said she would not negotiate in front of other people. She said something that made me see the full arc of the woman who had buried her first husband, raised children, and then learned to operate in layers. We will face what must be faced, but not on his terms. When a man like Nestor knows the possibility of discovery, he has options. He can deny, he can threaten, he can reshape a story into one where he is the injured party. Our move to hide the letters briefly hampered his options but did not eliminate them. Whatever we did next would have to account for the ways a man under suspicion might use charm and public persona as shields. On a rainy afternoon not long after, as we walked through the market to fetch vegetables, someone in the cafe window nodded and waved to Nestor. He waved back with the same measured smile that had once comforted my grandmother in the dark years after Antonio died. The town is a lattice of small alliances. Nestor's public ease had always been his armor. What we had found in the lining of his coat was a small, sharp object that could, if exposed, pierce that armor. But armor is meant to be worn. We chose to wait. We chose to plan. And for the moment we were all suspended in a kind of equilibrium where truth might topple us, or might be shelved forever. The coat, with its hidden paper, became like a wound that had been stitched closed. You could see the stitch and the scar, but not the hemorrhage it had once hidden. I kept thinking of the scrap of fabric sewn into my little coat, the one she said would protect me. The idea that protection might mean sheltering someone from knowing the truth, rather than sheltering them from harm, was a paradox I did not know how to hold yet. My grandmother had been both a shield and a keeper of secrets. Love had wrapped itself around choices that were at times indistinguishable from compromise. It was not until later, after more nights of careful conversation, after the copying of documents, after the strategic moves we made to keep the originals from prying eyes, that an event happened that cracked the thin film of protection we had placed over the truth. But that, for now, is a step further down the path. The rain had receded, but its traces remained. The lining had revealed its secret, and with that revelation came both a terrible clarity and a dangerous momentum. For now the coat sat folded, its lining pocket stitched shut again as if a seam could hold back consequences. Teresa kept moving through her days with the quiet dignity she always had, but every so often she would pause at the closet and look at the place where the coat hung as if measuring its distance from the rest of the house. She touched the welt on my childhood coat whenever she thought no one was looking, as if reaffirming an ancient promise. That promise now had two meanings. It protected in the small, tender way she intended when she sewed fabric into a child's coat. But it also protected by muffling a truth that had the power to change everything. The question, no longer rhetorical, was which kind of protection would win out. The small kindnesses that keep children warm, or the unvarnished truth that might shatter the fragile order of our lives. I did not know then what I know now, but the day the envelopes were found was the day the history of our family pivoted. It was the day my grandmother's stitches felt less like comfort and more like a ledger. It was the day the coat stopped being just an object and became evidence. When the phone rang late the next evening and a voice I recognized only too well said, without preamble, "You know what's sewn in that coat?" I felt the floor fall away. The conversation that followed was careful and thin, the kind of conversation people have when they are negotiating their roles in a drama none of them wanted to perform. He spoke as if offering counsel. He offered to help mend the lining. He said casually, as if it were an observation about the weather, "Some things are better left as they are." In the quiet that followed, I looked down at the scrap of cloth still stitched into the memory of my coat. I imagined blank pages, photocopies stored in a safe deposit box, a Bible folding around a confession, and I felt the weight of what we had chosen to do. For all the planning, nothing had changed the fact that a man had once written admitting to a crime and tucked it into a coat as if it were nothing more than a receipt. The next days would bring choices none of us could make lightly. We would have to decide whether to pursue the truth publicly or keep protecting ourselves. We would have to weigh the possibility that time had faded the path of justice, and also that exposing the past might destroy lives it did not need to destroy. We would have to reconcile the idea that protection can be a cage. And yet, despite everything, when I put on that old little coat now and felt the place where Grandma had sewn that scrap, I no longer only felt the warmth of a hand. I felt the tremor of history beneath my skin, a reminder that the things meant to keep us safe can, if stitched by the wrong hands, cover the shape of a lie. After we put the letters away, things did not settle. They rearranged themselves into a new tension. Hiding truth like that feels, strangely, both like cowardice and like care. We had wrapped the confession in the soft authority of an old Bible and closed it in a safety deposit box, but the knowledge of it moved in the house like an uninvited guest, present at meals, humming under the radio, appearing in the brief silences between people's words. Once you know a thing that big about someone you love, you see the world through that knowledge. Every small kindness from Nestor, fixing a faucet, bringing home bread, took on a different cast. The same hands that smoothed a tablecloth now read to be capable of other things. People who looked at him with admiration in the street seemed to be seeing only the costume, not the man underneath. We tried at first to live around the secret. Teresa went on with her days. She tended the plants on the windowsill. She made coffee at dawn. She kept her hair the same modest curl she always favored. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned patience the hard way. But secrets are active things. They leak. Whispered threats began to stitch themselves into the edges of ordinary conversations. Once, while I stood at the sink doing the dishes, a neighbor mentioned Nestor's name and slipped praise like a coin into a jar, and I felt suddenly queasy, the way you do when you hear a word you have sworn not to hear again. For all our carefulness, the day came when we could no longer pretend that nothing would happen if nothing was done. It was Luia who brought us to a breaking point. She had been the one to insist we copy the letters, to put the copies in the bank, to place the originals in the Bible. But she was also the one who refused to allow fear to calcify into a different kind of cage. "We can't live with this shadow," she said one evening, voice taut with exhaustion. "Either we make it stop, or it will keep growing into everything." We talked to a lawyer, not because we expected an easy victory. Laws are slow and years can erase the trail of small crimes, but to learn what staying silent might cost. The lawyer listened, a polite silhouette in a small office wallpapered with diplomas. He explained carefully that the passage of time complicates criminal prosecution. Witnesses die, memories blur, evidence is lost. He did not say, "He can't be charged." He said, "This will be difficult. This may not produce the justice you imagine." That legal hesitation landed on us like a cold rain. Justice, we saw, is not only about truth, it's about timing and proof and appetite for a fight. We were left to choose. Luia wanted to move the letters to a public place to demand accountability. Teresa wanted to protect what remained of her family, even if it meant letting the law do very little. We argued in the polite, hemming way people and families argue, page by careful page. Some nights we cried without wanting to be seen. Some nights we sat like statues listening to the radio play songs about other people's woes. Then Nestor, who had so far been a quiet storm, began to change his rhythms. He called more often for no reason he could name. At first his voice stayed smooth. Later, under that veneer, there was a pressure, a trying to recover control. There was one call where he spoke more kindly than usual, but then ended with a sentence that made my teeth set. "We need to fix things," he said. "People should not be meddling with memories." That attempt at control hardened into something more public. One afternoon, as if daring us, he arranged to be at the new shopping mall that had been built on the edge of town. A place of concrete and fluorescent light and the sort of anonymity that makes people braver or meaner, depending on what they carry. He sent messages that sounded as if they were casual. He was to be there around noon, he said. Perhaps he wanted to see the new bookstore, perhaps he wanted to run into the butcher, perhaps he wanted to be seen among the new lights. Luia wanted confrontation. I did not. Teresa did not want public drama, and I understood that. Public is a scale that changes everything. But staying hidden had begun to feel like another kind of silence that served him. We arranged, then, a meeting that was both deliberate and safe. We would not ambush him. We would meet in the mall's cafe where people and cameras made violence less likely. We would speak plainly. We would not let him stage the narrative. The day we went, the mall felt like a different world from the one we had grown up in. It smelled of roasted coffee and heated pretzels, and the hum of mannequins and sales got under your skin. We sat together, Teresa, Luia, Ricardo, myself, and watched a dozen small dramas play out across the floor. People pushed strollers. Teenagers shared earbuds. Children ran with the unnoted speed of who is allowed to be wild while adults balance what is left. We did not look wild. We were quiet, like animals who had chosen a clearing to rest in. Nestor arrived immaculate as always. He greeted people with a practiced warmth, and then saw us. For a second his face did the smallest register change, the cool of him becoming like a thin film. He moved toward us, the same man who in other rooms had been companionable, the same man who in a paper letter had claimed the most unimaginable thing. He sat down without ceremony. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a family getting together for coffee. To us, it was a reckoning. He didn't speak first. He took in our faces with the same slow assessment he had applied to coats, measuring seams, checking for loose threads. Then he folded his hands and said, "I suppose this is what this is about." Louia folded the letter from her pocket, the copy, and laid it on the table. It was a compact, decisive motion. Nestor's eyes flicked to it and then away, like a man glancing at a window in a storm. Around us, the mall continued its steady theater. No one yet understood that a small family scene contained a far larger story. "What do you want to say?" Teresa asked, voice even as a ruler. He inhaled, like someone about to recite a prepared line. For a strange moment, he seemed to consider recasting himself as the wounded party. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said in that same cool tone, the voice of a man who had practiced explanation in private. "I wanted to take care of her. I wanted happiness for us. It was not a mindless thing. It was deliberate. I am sorry for the grief." "You are sorry for the grief?" Louia's hand trembled on her cup. "Antonio is dead. That is your responsibility." He did not flinch. Instead, he leaned forward and said, in a tone that was almost soft, "I did it for love." There's a phrase people use when someone says something monstrous to try to justify it. You remember not the words, but the way the words land in your body. In my chest, that "for love" felt like ice. The words were both small and enormous. Small in grammar, enormous in implication. "That's not love," Teresa said with an authority that made heads turn in the cafe. "Love does not countenance choosing the life of another to buy your own. Love does not count the smallest measures of harm as a path to intimacy." He smiled then, not kind but practiced, and tried to recast his gesture into something noble and misunderstood. People nearby glanced over. Somewhere, a child tripped, and an older woman laughed. The world around us performed distraction. But the conversation at our table was now the fulcrum on which everything tilted. Nestor's voice grew impatient. A man who has kept secrets for years will conserve them in neat compartments, and he will be furious when anyone disrupts their order. "This is private," he said. "You are making a scene." "It's not a scene to be told in whispers anymore," Louia shot back. "You confessed. We found your handwriting. That is not speculation." He tried another tack. Explain, minimize, charm. At one point he said, "I provided for her. I kept the house. I did what had to be done." The language of duty croaked badly as justification. Ricardo, who had been sitting there like a steady stone, did not stand up until the word "done" left Nestor's mouth. Then, with a quiet force I had seen before when he blocked a drunken man at a bar and took him out of harm, he rose and moved to where Nestor sat so close the two men could have exchanged a handshake. Ricardo did not hit him. That is not our way. He spoke instead in a voice that belonged to someone who loved the family and would protect it. "You will leave her alone," Ricardo said. "You will leave this family alone." People were now watching in earnest. The cafe had turned into a tiny amphitheater. Nestor put on that same smile that had steadied him for decades and said, "I am a man who has done hard things for people I loved. I will not be shamed here." Teresa looked at him and, in a voice that made even the cafe's clatter drop a notch, said, "You will not be living in my house anymore." There was nothing theatrical in her words. They were simply a boundary set like a fence. Then the small old man in the neat coat, no longer the tidy figure in the doorway but a man whose private self had been laid bare by a child's scrap of paper, said the thing we all dreaded. He stood, and with calm and terrible conviction, tried to rearrange the narrative to his advantage. That the past was not as it seemed, that people had misread motives, that there were other explanations. When Teresa refused to be swayed, he grew flustered and then furious. His hands shook just enough to betray the steady facade. I remember the way he said one line with a mix of pleading and command that later would be quoted in our house like a black comedy. "I wanted her to be free of suffering. I wanted to make us whole." The sentence landed like a bad currency. That was the end of it. No dramatic arrest, no sudden confession beyond what was already on paper. He left, with people in the cafe politely returning to their meals as if that might smother the moment. But the scene had changed us all. Walking out of the mall, we were quieter, and the whole town's air felt different, as if the arrangement of neighborly trust had been slid a few degrees off its hinges. After the mall, we moved quickly. There was no single dramatic chase, just the pressing, quiet urgency of people who knew confrontation had a price. We went to Ricardo's house for a few days, sleeping in shifts, cooking in a kitchen that belonged to a man who had made a life lesson out of bread, and we talked about options as if laying out a garment we might wear. Nestor's immediate reaction, his rage, his effort to control the story, made something obvious. Staying in the same roof with him was neither safe nor sensible. Teresa, who had always been careful with decisions that affected children, finally took the step that felt inevitable. She filed for separation, then divorce. The paperwork moved like a slow machine. Each form was an incision, necessary but unsettling. We did not march into courtrooms with banners and righteous fury. We walked through legal steps with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief to mark a line, dread at what endings force you to clarify. Legal action against a crime was a different matter. The lawyer we had seen explained, again with careful hands, that prosecuting an act decades old was possible in some legal systems but rarely straightforward. Records can be lost, witnesses die, and prisons do not return lost years. He advised us we could present the letters to local authorities and try to open an investigation. Whether such an investigation would lead to charges was uncertain. The lawyer did not say no, but he did say, "This will be complicated." That complicated answer felt like a small bitterness. It was at that moment Carmen, our neighbor and a woman who worked at the municipal records office, offered a direction none of us had fully considered. She had told me once over coffee that the hospital had a tendency to keep odd things, registers, old reports, something that sometimes survived the rot of time. "Not everything goes to the dustbin," she had said. "Sometimes it waits for curious people." Curiosity can be a dangerous virtue in families, but it can also be a healer. If the hospital had kept records, and if those records showed signs of poisoning, then the letters were not idle boasts or delusions. They had tethering facts. We drove then to the hospital archivist late one afternoon. The hospital looked smaller than I had imagined, dressed in white paint that the sun had made thin. The woman behind the desk was older, narrow-shouldered, with spectacles that slid down her nose. When we explained, carefully, politely, what we were asking for, she did not distract us with administrative platitudes. She listened, and then she disappeared into the lower rooms where the archives lived like a different city. Archives are queer places. They smell of paper, of pens, of the dead little moments that keep their own time. The archivist returned with a folder that had been labeled and relabeled in hand-lettered script. Inside were hospital notes, dates, the names of doctors, brief descriptions of symptoms. There was also, tucked in a folder padded by old gauze paper, a toxicology report with numbers, and the notation that suggested arsenic had been present. The words were clinical, restrained, devoid of the heat that makes a confession dramatic, yet their presence was more of a blow than any raised voice. We read in silence. The report confirmed that in 1957 Antonio had signs consistent with arsenic exposure, recorded in the file with a physician's note. It did not say who was responsible. It did not pronounce guilt. It sat there like an impartial thing saying, "This happened." Hearing that the hospital had corroborated the possibility of poisoning did not make us feel triumphant. It made us feel both justified and more sorrowful. The letter and the report together formed a pattern. The paper in the coat had claimed intent. The hospital file suggested that Antonio's illness had the chemical signature the letter mentioned. The two documents together were, for us, enough to make the truth more than rumor. After we had copies, carefully made and placed in envelopes, we went back to Teresa's house with the peculiar mix of quiet satisfaction and crushing grief that comes from vindication. These were the moments when truth brings you no perverse joy. It only rearranges the furniture and asks you to inhabit a new room. We took the documents to the lawyer. He arranged to file them with the police. The officers who came to take notes were polite and acted with a gravity that made me think of rituals. There was an investigation opened, in the paper sense. Investigators were cautious, noting the historical nature of the evidence. But the law is not only a letter. It is politics, resources, time. The response we received in months that followed was patient, slow, and careful. There were interviews. There were records to unearth. There was, in truth, a sense that the legal system was trying to be as thorough as it could be, with the resources it had. Whether that thoroughness would translate into a criminal charge against a man who had lived his life after the crime, who had been a neighbor, an employer, a friend to many, was never assured. In practical terms, the confirmation from the hospital felt like a kind of deliverance, proof that whatever we had suspected was rooted in fact. It vindicated Teresa's long-hidden suspicion and the paper that had been sewn into a brown coat. But it did not neatly solve the grief. Often validation is a quiet wooden thing. It eases self-doubt, but it does not mend other injuries. After the hospital files, life worked itself into a new, awkward shape. Teresa moved into a small house near Luia. The children took sides in the ways adult children do. Some stayed distant, others returned like tides. Miguel, who had grown up under both men's shadows, found himself torn. His father was Nestor, the man who had kept order and brought bread. But the man described in ink could not be so easily unmade. Miguel loved his father with the complicated love of sons. He also could not ignore the evidence. One evening, after months of uneasy conversation, Miguel came to Teresa with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know," he said. "Part of me wants to believe in the man who taught me to tie my shoes. Part of me hears the letters and sees the reports and cannot sleep." His voice broke around the edges. He asked for time. He asked for space. He asked, in the end, for forgiveness he did not yet have language to request. We did what families often do. We kept rooms open even where trust had been shattered. Teresa began, at a friend's insistence, to see a therapist, Dr. Helena, who had a soft voice and a chair that seemed to remember the shape of sorrow. Therapy was a place Teresa had resisted at first. Therapy was a thing of other people, not of women who had stitched coats and fed children with hands that had calluses. But when she sat with Dr. Helena, she found a space where grief could be untangled from the armor of dignity she had for so long worn. "I thought protection meant keeping things hidden," Teresa told the therapist once, "the way one confesses a small theft. I thought I could keep the children from ruin by being careful with truth." Dr. Helena listened without flinching. "Protection is not only about hiding," she said. "Sometimes it is about setting people free from things that wound them across years." Therapy became, for Teresa, a slow practice of letting go of shame. She found in that quiet room permission to be angry and also to be gentle with herself for the choices she'd made. She learned that giving children the truth, even painful truth, could be part of love, not only a recklessness. It did not erase the fact that she had tried to keep a family intact. It allowed her to see the reasons she had done so with compassion for herself. For me, the healing curve was jagged. I felt often unmoored between loyalty to my grandmother and the need to see justice in some way. There were nights where I thought about that small scrap sewn into my coat and what it had meant as a child, safety, ritual, magic, and what it meant now, a symbol of the way truth had been muffled. I began to understand the dimensions of protection, how it can be a kindness, and how it can be a way to preserve a lie. Nestor's life after our confrontation became quieter, and somehow more hollow. He was no longer welcome in the house. People in town talked in softer tones. His presence, once a shield, became a subject. He tried at times to re-enter our lives with small kindnesses, as if those acts could restore what had been broken. Sometimes he called, sometimes he left flowers on the doorstep, and then, as if testifying to a private ritual, walked away. But the rhythm had changed, no longer the steady, unquestioned man he'd been. Years went on. Life accumulates in small increments: birthdays, funerals, a new roof, a broken radio. Teresa found, unexpectedly, one winter evening, that she enjoyed the company of a man named Roberto. He was gentle in a way that had little need for spectacle. He liked books and told stories slowly, with a patience that felt like a balm. There was no drama in their folding together. It was a thing of quiet meals and shared silences. People in town watched them and murmured, but Teresa seemed to hold a sturdier peace. There was a time when companionship looked like a risk. In Roberto, she found a kind of steady, unthreatening kindness that did not require secrecy. Our family continued to live with the documents we had saved. The letters, photocopies, and the hospital report were locked in a drawer in Luia's house, where they felt less like trophies and more like a ledger of past wrongs. We did not exhibit them. We did not parlay them for gossip. They were there as proof for those who needed it, and as a reminder of what had occurred. Nestor's end came quietly, as many things do. He died years later of causes that were ordinary in the way they happened to men of certain ages, age and time doing their inevitable work. We did not gloat, and we did not feel a surge of vindication. The news read like a sentence at the end of a long, complex paragraph. Final. Unemphatic. Teresa felt a small, old grief tilt itself back into place, not the grief of shock but of a life containing many things at once. People die, and we carry complicated feelings about them. After his death, the question of the coat surfaced again, like an old wound that had formed a scab and now needed to be reopened to heal properly. We gathered at Teresa's house, and the coat lay on the table like an artifact that had been part of 1,000 small rituals. It had been with him through public life and private misdeeds. It had hidden a confession, and in doing so, had become a repository for the family's history. There were many ways we could deal with the coat. Some wanted to preserve it, to keep it as an object that marked history. Others wanted to burn it, to make the destruction symbolic. Roberta, the neighbor who had known Teresa since girlhood, said quietly, "We should not let the coat keep owning the house." In the end, Teresa decided to let it go. The decision felt right because it was hers, and because it was symbolic in a way that mattered. We took the coat to a patch of ground near the river where she had once taken Antonio on a Saturday afternoon to watch the light fall on the water. It was a small ceremony, no priest, no spectacle, just family. We folded the coat, said private words, the kind of thing you say when you stitch a wound with laughter and tears, and then set it to burn. I remember the smell of smoke and the way the flames licked the fabric and the odd feeling of relief that followed. The coat, which had once been a shelter and then an accusation, became ash. The letters we had preserved did not go with it. They remained in their locked place, kept as a record, not as objects of vengeance. Destroying the coat did not erase what had been done. It did something different. It allowed us to own the ending of a chapter, to take a physical object that had carried weight and change its form. The ash sifted into the soil. The wind took what it would. For Teresa, who had been careful with so many decisions, this was a small act of agency. After that, life continued, the way seasons continue. Teresa and Roberto walked together, slower than lovers of youth, and more certain of each other's habits. She took to the garden in a more deliberate way, planting things that would not need her constant tending. Succulents, rosemary. She spoke to Dr. Helena for a while, and she found friends in the quiet circles of town, women who had their own histories of being protected and betrayed. Miguel and Luia worked on their relationships with one another. The fracture that the letters had made in the family did not vanish. Fractures leave new edges. But there was also repair. There were dinners and Sundays when laughter arrived almost by accident at the table. There were conversations that had been hard, where people said things they had held for years, and then after they were said, felt smaller for being said, and somehow easier to live with. For me, the story of the coat stayed with me in ways that folded into who I became. I found myself keen to know how the world hid things and how people kept their lives orderly with small rituals. I kept the memory of the scrap sewn into my childhood coat as both a tender thing and as a lesson. Tenderness can coexist with danger. Kindness can be used as camouflage. I learned that protection is not a simple noun, but a verb with many forms, some of which are gentle and some of which are cruel. Years later, sitting with Teresa on a bench by the river, she took my hand and said, as she had so many times, "I wanted to protect you." There was no defensiveness in her voice or explanation, only an acceptance of the complicated ledger of life. "I meant to keep you warm," she added, and we both smiled with the kind of small foolishness people share at the end of a long story. "But I see now that truth protects in a different way. What did the scrap in my coat protect me from?" At first I would have said a child's fears. Rain, cold, the dark. Later I learned it had been part of a different protection. A way for Teresa to carry knowledge close without breaking everything at once. In the final accounting, the scrap, and the letters sewn into the brown coat, protected me from living my life within a comforting lie. It forced us, however painfully, to look and to act, to decide what we valued. The maintenance of appearances or the messy, difficult work of being honest. We had choices to make in those years, about whether to demand legal retribution, about whether to seek public shame, about whether to let the town continue on in ignorant benevolence. We chose different responses at different times: privacy, confrontation, court papers, therapy, and in the end, the small ceremonial burning of a coat. We did not do everything perfectly. We did not do everything boldly. We did what seemed right in the moment, guided by the care for children, by the need to keep people safe, and by the desire to reckon with truth. The last time I put my hand in the pocket where the scrap had been, the fabric was thin and worn. I could not find the stitch she had made that day when I was 7, but I could still feel the memory of the slow, certain way her fingers had moved. That memory is the thing I keep, not a map of how to avoid pain, but a reminder of how complex love is. Protection is often a mix of shelter and restraint. It can warm you. It can also keep you from seeing the sky. If there's a lesson here, it is not an easy one. Secrets can shelter. Secrets can injure. The courage to look, slowly, carefully, and with love for those who have been harmed, is a kind of protection in itself. Justice, where it can come, is a form of truth. But truth also has to be balanced with mercy and the practicalities of life. We acted the way we did because we were trying to keep the living breathing. We did not always know what that would demand. I tell this story now because the little things adults do when they think they are keeping you safe often have consequences you cannot imagine as a child. The scrap in my coat protected me from cold and from the small, lonely fears of being a child. It also, more importantly, led, decades later, to a discovery that changed the shape of our family. The protection my grandmother offered was complicated, as are the intentions of people who mean well and fail. If this story resonated with you, if you have a family secret or memory that altered your life, share it in the comments. I read them, and these small acts of remembering keep the past honest. If you'd like more stories like this, subscribe, and we'll keep looking at the quiet things families carry. Thank you for listening.